So today, as I said, we're hosting a very special webinar. We're very fortunate to have Sherry Franjevic here, who is a green chemistry and sustainable design consultant, who will be talking about the green screen for safer chemicals, which was developed by an organization called Clean Production Action. And this is a preview of the Green Screen for Safer Chemicals training workshop that will be held Tuesday, May 8th in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in conjunction with the 7th Annual Green Chemistry and Commerce Council Innovators Roundtable. Sherry combines her strong technical foundation with her commitment to human and environmental health as a self-employed consultant. For the past 5 years, Sherry has been partnering with organizations such as Clean Production Action and facilitating diverse multi-stakeholder groups such as the U.S. EPA Design for the Environment Technical Committees. The focus of her work is to advance the understanding of and promote design and use of green chemicals, sustainable materials, and environmentally preferable products. She has quite a lot of experience. She began her career in industry, where she led research and design projects for consumer product companies, including consumer product companies, having a hard time today, consumer product companies, including Procter & Gamble, Frito-Lay, General Mills, and 3M. So I'm going to turn it over to Sherry now and listen to our webinar. Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you, Lynn, for that introduction, and thank you, Lynn and Clinton and the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network and Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse for inviting me to speak today. So as Lynn mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on an introduction to the Green Screen for Safer Chemicals and presenting it at a fairly high level. We do go into greater depth in our day-long 8-hour training, so I will do my best to paint a picture for you today and give you an idea of what the Green Screen is. And I will be speaking on behalf of Clean Production Action today. So I wanted to take a moment to say something about Clean Production Action. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and the organization really focuses on strategic and pragmatic solutions in 3 key areas: green chemicals, sustainable materials, and environmentally preferable products. And the organization has put out a number of really valuable reports, from healthy building strategies to strategies in the electronics industry. And they have 2 key flagship projects. The first being the Business NGO Working Group, which is a really unique collaboration. And this group sets a path forward in working together and really prioritizing projects in this realm, in these same key 3 areas. And it's a group of people that comes together to create pragmatic tools, share best practices, develop strategies, and really try to bring industry as a whole forward as quickly as possible through that collaboration. And you can find information about both of these projects at the Clean Production Action website. And the second key flagship project of Clean Production Action is the Green Screen for Safer Chemicals. And today on this talk, what I'll be focusing on mostly is the foundational element of that program, which is the Green Screen methodology. There is also a growing infrastructure that Clean Production Action is building to support the implementation and really the uptake and bringing to scale of the methodology in industry, addressing ease of use, things like automation of pieces that can be automated, validation, creating repositories for completed assessments. So all that is also under the umbrella of the Green Screen program. So with that, what is the Green Screen and what am I going to cover today? The Green Screen for Safer Chemicals is a comparative chemical hazard assessment method. And what I want to talk about in my talk today is just to start with some foundational concepts upon which the Green Screen was built, then talk through on a very high level how it works, and then the third piece, just talk about some case studies and key applications of the Green Screen today. So the first key concept that is at the heart of the green screen is green chemistry. And I'm assuming that everyone on this phone call is quite familiar with the definition that Paul Anastas and John Warner put out for green chemistry of reducing or eliminating the use or generation of hazardous substances. 5 of the 12 principles of green chemistry are really largely incorporated and form a foundation of the green screen methodology, and those are listed on the right-hand side. And what the green screen really looks to do is to take these foundational principles and then design metrics around how to implement these principles. So for example, using safer solvents and auxiliaries, how do you measure what's safer and how do you select a safer solvent or auxiliary? So that the green screen takes it to that pragmatic level from these foundational principles. The second key concept is a principle of some of the really instrumental work at the U.S. EPA's Design for the Environment program. And the idea here is that every chemical in a given product is there because it serves a specific function. Maybe it's there to make a plastic more pliable, or it's there to prevent degradation of a certain type of product. Maybe it's an antioxidant or a stabilizer. And when organizations are looking to select materials or replace materials, what they're really looking for is that functionality. So you can group chemicals by their functionality and then take them and line them up by hazard to select safer alternatives, which leads me to this third key concept, which is the idea of hazard banding. And the idea here, again, is that each chemical, based on its inherent properties, its actual structure, and its physical chemical properties, has a set of inherent toxicity properties that go with it. And so you can look at those chemicals and place them along a continuum based on their inherent hazard, from ingredients that have characteristics of concern all the way through to ingredients that are considered of lower concern or safer ingredients. And this same concept doesn't just come from the U.S. EPA Design for the Environment program. It is certainly reflected in a lot of national and international precedent, including being sort of a foundation of the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling. So a little bit about the green screen and where it comes from. So back in about 2005, 2006, the U.S. EPA Design for the Environment program initiated their first of many partnerships. And at that time, they were looking at alternatives to pentabromo-diphenyl ether as a flame retardant for furniture foam. And they brought together a group of stakeholders and went through a process of looking at alternatives and looking at the hazards of the particular chemicals and their alternatives. And at the same time, there were a number of states that were looking to ban certain brominated flame retardants. And they were charged with demonstrating that there was indeed safer alternatives available to things like DECA and Penta. And through this partnership work, building off of it, Clean Production Action actually did a case study looking at DECA, bromodiphenyl ether, and a couple of alternatives. And through the process of doing this case study, developed the green screen method, which was originally embedded in this case study. So a little bit more about this DFE partnership. And what they did was they convened a group of stakeholders. Again, this was industry, academia, government, nonprofit organizations, to look at, to compile a list of all the potential alternatives for that particular function. And then they did a comprehensive review using all the EPA expertise at hand. And they came out with this really pivotal piece of work, the hazard summary table, that I'll show in just a minute, which is a comprehensive look at the hazard of all the chemicals and their alternatives. The program itself continues to do work and continues to develop. They actually have partnerships going right now for a number of the EPA Action Plan chemicals that are listed here. And they've also continued to do work to make the criteria more and more robust and more transparent. And they published their hazard criteria back in August of 2011, last summer. And that's something that Clean Production Action continues to work to harmonize with, and we continue to co-evolve our thinking as the science evolves. So this table here is sort of the hallmark of chemical hazard assessment. And this was a really foundational piece of work that came out of that EPA partnership program. And one of the key things that makes it so valuable is that essentially this table took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of toxicology data and actual assessments and professional judgment and rationale and crystallized it into the single image. So it's really dense with a lot of information. So I'll explain it very briefly. On the left-hand side are the names of the products and then the ingredients in each of those products, so the different chemicals. And then across the top are each of the different hazard endpoints that are evaluated, different health effects and environmental effects. And then in the matrix in the middle, what you have is a hazard assessment, and each of the letters stands for a hazard level, H for high, M for moderate, L for low. And the other thing that they're indicating here, in addition to the hazard level, is also the level of confidence in that hazard call. So for example, for the very first chemical listed here under cancer, it's deemed a moderate hazard, and it's shown in bold colored text, which means that's a high confidence call. It may be based on measured data, a high weight of evidence. For the same first chemical for bioaccumulation, the hazard call was low, and it's shown in an italicized black letter, which indicates that it's a lower confidence call. It may be based on estimated data, in this case, or a model. So that all that information about both the hazard level and the level of confidence for all those chemicals are summarized in this context. So with this work, the intention of the EPA is to put all this information together so that companies could take this information and use it to make informed decisions. And the next logical question that came out of this amazing, very dense piece of work was, okay, well, how do I take that next step to use this really, detailed information to make a material selection decision? And questions were asked like, well, do I just count how many high hazards there are and pick the one with the lowest number? Or what's that decision logic to take that leap? And that's where Clean Production Action really came in and filled that gap and took that next step. And so the real key value add of the green screen is it takes that hazard assessment information, building off of what the EPA approach had done, and it takes it and builds a decision logic such that chemicals can be placed along a continuum, like the hazard banding we talked about earlier, from benchmark 1 to benchmark 4, 1 bad, 4 good, and allows that to be another key piece in decision making. And some of the reasons that organizations are picking up on the green screen, and some of the key things about it, is that it is publicly accessible. All the documents are available on the Clean Production Action website. Everything is completely transparent. There aren't black boxes, so the criteria are published, guidance are published, all the decision logic is published. It's also peer-reviewed. It's developed. The method continues to evolve based on advances in science, as well as user feedback on usability of the tool itself. And there's a technical advisory committee, and there's been peer review processes to release the latest versions. And Green Screen version 1.2 is what's currently available. So the next piece that I wanted to go through at a high level was how the green screen works, or how you actually do an assessment. And it's 3 key steps. The first is to assess and classify hazard. And basically that step is generating that hazard summary table that we showed, that table 4-1 from the US EPA. It's something like that you're generating through that process. The second is to apply the benchmarks so that you're binning the chemical from benchmark 1 to 4. And the third is to then use that information to make an informed decision. So these are the hazard endpoints that are included in the green screen. It is a relatively comprehensive set of hazard endpoints, and it's based on a lot of different national and international precedent. Some of the primary sources include the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling, both the US EPA New Chemicals Program and DFE, Designed for the Environment Program, and the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, Screening Information Data Set. The hazard endpoints are grouped. The group 1, human health, tend to be more chronic endpoints or relatively severe hazard endpoints. Group 2 tend to be either more acute effects or more potency-based. And then there's also the environmental toxicity and fate, as well as physical hazards, which were put in there largely to address worker health and safety concerns. So for each of these hazard endpoints, there is a very detailed set of criteria that are used to classify each endpoint at a given hazard level. And depending on the different endpoint, there may be up to 5 levels from very low to very high hazard. And there are 2 different sets or types of criteria. There's criteria that can be applied to data that's available, that may be measured data or estimated data. Those are largely based on the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling, or GHS. We also include a list-based portion. And the idea here is that if there are already chemicals that have been assessed comprehensively by experts, vetted, and there's relative consensus amongst the scientific community about their hazard, there's no reason to redo that work. So streamlining and making things more cost-effective, we've put a lot of effort into actually taking over 500 lists and list categories and translating them into these hazard levels, and have even taken steps to automate that through various partnerships. So that piece of it can happen instead of in hours, it can happen in seconds. And then that's combined with the piece that still needs a lot more professional judgment and human interaction with the data assessment and looking at multiple sources and identifying appropriate analogs. So coming out of this first step, what you get looks similar to what the DFE hazard table looks like. Again, in developing this, we're doing a comprehensive search of all available information that's out there. So it is based on specific measured tests, but it can also be based on professional judgment, analogs, read across, models. All available information is used. And the other thing I will point out here is that there is, in addition to the different hazard levels, there also is this DG, and that refers to a data gap. And what that means is that given all the available information and data that are out there and all the professional judgment, there still is insufficient information to even make a call on that hazard. Maybe the mechanism of action isn't well enough known, or there's not a suitable analog for that chemical. So those uncertainties are highlighted in the hazard summary table, and they do also get incorporated into how the chemical is benchmarked. So it gives an indication of known hazard as well as uncertainty. The second step is to apply the benchmarks, which is really the heart of the value add that Clean Production Action offers with the green screen method. And the benchmarking is really where the prioritization and the subjectivity and the values get built in. And what Mark Rossi and Lauren Hein, who are the co-authors of the green screen, really intended to do was, with this benchmark 1, the most hazardous chemicals, to look at regulatory drivers and precedent and align as much as possible with those. So when organizations are looking at chemicals to regulate, what are the known bad actors? And oftentimes the focus has been on things like CMRs, or carcinogenic, mutagenic, reproductive and developmental toxicants, and PBTs, persistent and bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals. So that was how sort of benchmark 1 got aligned. Benchmark 4 is very aspirational, so low hazard across the board. And then they developed this continuum to fill in benchmark 2 and 3. And essentially how it works is you start at the bottom and you look at your hazard summary table that you just developed, and each one of those lines is a set of criteria within that bin. So for benchmark 1, you look at 1A and you ask yourself the question, is this chemical a PBT? If the answer is yes, you stop there. It's a benchmark 1 chemical. If the answer is no, you go on to the next question, 1B. Is it very persistent and very bioaccumulative? If the answer is yes, again, it's a benchmark 1. If the answer is no, you continue on. It only takes one yes to fall into that benchmark. So only one failing of a criteria and the chemical stops at that benchmark. But if the answer is no to all of those criteria, then you move up to the next bin. Out of that process, what you get is a benchmark score. So this is an example, and it's a piece from an actual assessment report with a green screen rating for vinyl acetate, which is a benchmark score of 2. And you'll see that there's additional information there about what drove that particular benchmark score. And you'll also see that there's a hazard summary table associated with it. And beyond this are pages of the actual data that support these hazard classifications and the rationale for that. So the final step is to use this information to make an informed decision. One way that this benchmarking can be used, for example, is to compare results for a certain functional class of chemicals, building on that principle we talked about earlier. So, for example, you have a bunch of plasticizers and you want to compare them. You can group them by the benchmark score that they received. And one of the values of that is that while there's an incredible depth of expertise and toxicology that went into getting to that benchmark, at this point, it's a simple integer score that can be easily communicated to a non-technical audience. So your engineers and your purchasers can use that score to actually make informed decisions, material selection decisions. So the idea is to move towards preferred materials. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some folks who are using the green screen and how they're using it. Hewlett-Packard is currently the world's leading practitioner of the green screen. And in fact, they have made a commitment to use it in replacing restricted substances. And they actually, this is a page from their Global Citizenship Report. And the commitment that they've made is specific to chemicals that they're replacing that are restricted substances. So again, what are the drivers? Definitely restricted substances is a huge driver. The number of restrictions is continuing to increase, more jurisdictions, more reporting requirements, and there's even some, for example, state legislation is starting to require alternatives assessment or specify it. And so an example here of a state legislation is the California regs, the Safer Consumer Product Regulations in draft form that we're all aware of. The historical approach to addressing material restrictions has been to essentially look at all unregulated substances as on par or equally available, and then use selection criteria based on cost, function, reliability, manufacturability. And the issue with that approach, of course, is that you may be jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. So you may be making what's known as a regrettable substitution. You may select a chemical that happens to have a very similar structure to the one that's being regulated, which is why it maybe produces a function in such a nice, easy drop-in way, but it may also have very similar toxicity profile because of that. So it may be the next one on the list to be regulated. So taking a more active approach is looking at hazard as at this first level, at the entry level of what crosses the gate to a potential replacement, and ensuring that the chemical that you're moving towards is actually inherently lower environmental impact or lower hazard than the chemical that you're moving away from. And the idea here is not only to avoid future regulatory impacts, but also avoid unintended consequences of human health and environmental health. And really taking a more proactive approach, or the idea of future-proofing, moving towards developing products that won't be regulated anytime soon. And there is a really strong business case to do this. Of course, replacing materials is very expensive. For a company the size of Hewlett-Packard, with the complexity of their supply chain, it can cost them $5 to $50 million to replace a single chemical in their supply chain. So it makes really good business sense to get it right the first time. So HP started out just with a little pilot program where they were looking at different tools that were out there and testing out the green screen to see what it can do. And what they found was that it was really effective at differentiating between chemicals that they were looking at, different alternatives. And they've moved into a phase where they actually have a mandatory program. An example is for their PVC alternatives, where suppliers are required to provide a green screen assessment and benchmark of the material in addition to other information. And it's kind of to get in the gate to be considered as an alternative. And they've been successful with this program. They've actually done a number of trainings with some suppliers, and they have implemented this program and have been able to approve a number of materials. And just another note is that Hewlett-Packard and others, again, use this green screen or the comparative chemical hazard assessment as a piece of their decision-making process. It doesn't mean that it's the only tool in their toolkit, but they add it in as a really important piece, and they add it in at the front end and early in design decisions or material selection decisions, but still use all other available tools for looking at broader impacts and context as well. So the second example that I wanted to point out was PolyOne. And PolyOne is a plastic manufacturer, a supplier of halogen and phthalate-free products, and they got into this whole thing through their relationship with Hewlett-Packard. They are a supplier of Hewlett-Packard. And what they found was that the green screen for them ended up being a very valuable tool in product development. And so Jonathan Plisko says, the more you know about what you're putting into your products, the more likely you are to make better choices in product development. And they found that this systematic, rigorous, consistent approach helped them really look at all the ingredients they were putting in their product and identify places where maybe there's an ingredient in there that didn't really need to be in there, and it's a high hazard ingredient and they could pull it. Or there were situations where they had an ingredient in there that could easily be replaced with a drop-in with that same functionality, and that's not always the case. Certainly there's cases where it highlights a huge need to identify a new material, or even, in the fundamentals of green chemistry, design a new molecule that meets the functionality and has lower hazard. But they've found it to be incredibly helpful in their own product development process. So I want to just take a step back for a moment as I conclude sort of this overview of the green screen and step back to comparative chemical hazard assessment, and say first that it's becoming increasingly important for us both in business and in the regulatory realms. And organizations are recognizing more and more that material selection goes far beyond cost and performance, while those are still very critical factors. And some organizations are even starting to look at hazardous chemicals as actually a quality defect, because it creates these regulatory risks that are undesired and human and environmental health impacts. So sort of reframing it in that way. Again, comparative chemical hazard assessment, while it's essential and it's a really important part of this bigger picture of alternatives assessment, it's not sufficient. It's not the whole picture. So it's to be used in combination with lots of other tools. And we do have, in the training that I'll talk about in just a moment, we have a number of sessions that talk about how do you start integrating this piece into the broader context of other tools. And the green screen is a leading method for comparative chemical hazard assessment. And again, some of the things that we hear from users that really drive them to use it are it's scientifically based, it's really robust, publicly accessible, transparent, very comprehensive, and that it really does build on this foundation of national and international precedent. So it's not about reinventing the wheel, but building from what's already there. And there's great intention around harmonization. And the last thing I'll mention is with the green screen is that, again, there is a lot of work underway to build a broader infrastructure to support scaling the use of the green screen. And so some of those initiatives include automating what can be automated through partnerships. There's two different partnerships that I'll mention. One is with the Works, has a GreenWorks tool where they're automating the Clean Production Action Green Screen Lite, which is the name of the list translator. So basically it takes the over 500 lists and list categories and translates them into hazards and benchmarks. And they've automated that. And then the second being the Pharos database by the Healthy Building Network, who you're hearing from Tom Lent in a couple of months at another webinar. Their tool, their chemical and material library, has also incorporated the green screen benchmarks and some with the hazard levels as well. And other pieces of the program include things like a public repository where assessments can be shared so we don't have to do the same assessments over and over again. And also folks who are qualified professionally to be a second party to do assessments for organizations. So those are all pieces of the program. So in the last few remaining moments, I want to just tell you a little bit about the upcoming green screen training. And the next training that we're offering is Tuesday, May 8th in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it's an 8-hour training. And the links to the registration and additional information are here on this slide that will be made available to you. It's being sponsored predominantly by a grant through the U.S. EPA Region 5 under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And you'll see we have a number of partners through that grant as well, including the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network, the National Pollution Prevention Roundtable, and the Great Lakes Regional Pollution Prevention Roundtable. This particular training is also being sponsored and hosted by NSF International and sponsored by the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, who are holding their 7th Annual Innovators Roundtable the 3 days after our training at the same location, and really valuable work. If you don't know anything about that, I would recommend looking into that as well. The lineup of speakers we have for this training is really phenomenal, and I will just highlight a few. Lauren Hine is one of the co-authors of the Green Screen. Helen Holder from Hewlett-Packard is a phenomenal speaker, and she really has the expertise of, how do you take this method and implement it pragmatically in industry? How do you convince your management that this is something useful? How do you integrate it into your existing business decision-making systems? And she does a great job of facilitating a discussion and really addressing issues and some of the concerns that folks have about how do you implement this, how do you integrate it with the other tools that you are using. Emma Lavoie from the US EPA Design for the Environment program is one of the co-authors of the CFE alternative assessment criteria, very knowledgeable in that foundational piece of the hazard assessment. And then we have the 2 organizations that are qualified profilers for Green Screen, meaning that they're qualified to do assessments so other companies can hire them as a second party, non-biased second party, to do Green Screen assessments for them. So they have a ton of experience doing these kinds of assessments. Will also be there. And this is just a quick look at the agenda, and I'll say a few things. One is that the intention of the training is really to be interactive. We'll have discussions, we'll have exercises, it'll be hands-on. And it's really for folks that want to know actually how to perform an assessment, but it's also for folks who may be users of Green Screen assessments to make informed decisions. So if you're a designer or a decision maker, you need to understand what goes into getting this score, understand how robust it is, understand the value of it, so that either you can confidently use the results of this tool and or advocate for the use of it or implementation of it within the organization. So it's for a broad range of audience. If you can't make it in May, we do have 6 trainings over the next 3 years in the Great Lakes region, the next one being in November 15th in Chicago, and that is being held in conjunction with a green chemistry conference that's being put on by the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network and the Great Lakes Regional Pollution Prevention Roundtable. And just wanted to make sure that I had in here a slide where you can get additional information. And it is where you can get training information. It's also where you can get tons more information on the Green Screen itself. You can download all the method documents. There's an incredible amount of resources on the Clean Production Action website. And we do have a place where you can sign up for the Green Screen listserv so that you'll be updated when the method updates or when there's additional trainings and things like that. Alrighty. So with that, I would like to thank you all. And I believe Lynn is going to facilitate the discussion from here, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Before I want to just mention that I want to reiterate that there will be a second webinar. This webinar will be repeated by the, and it will be sponsored by the National Pollution Prevention Roundtable. And that will happen, I think it is April 3rd on a Thursday. You can go to their website, which is www.p2.org for more information. And as they are one of the partners in this program and in our efforts to do these webinars around the Great Lakes Basin in the United States. And I also want to mention that at that same website, you can find out about their Safer Chemistry Challenge program, which is also part of the grant from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So I really encourage you to check that out. And if you know people who were interested in coming today but couldn't make it, they do have another chance to listen to the webinar. And this also goes to the first question that we got, which was a request for a copy of the presentation for the students of the questionnaire, and we hope to have, we definitely want to get this into as many hands as we can. We hope to have it posted on our website, www.glgc.org. I'm going to say within the next week, and if it's not up, I will email you at least a copy of the PDF file of the slides. And but as I said, we're really going to try to get that up. We have a large backload waiting to be posted of our webinars. So the other question, we received two other questions, and let's see. I'm sorry that I'm well, so I'm just going to go to a question here. The opening slide regarding process mentions both hazard and exposure as factors of concern. The remaining presentations mention only hazard. How is risk factored into the decision making?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I think the reference may be to the DFE hazard summary table. Essentially, where risk is factored into this process is in the section on making informed decisions. So that's a much more complicated process that leverages the benchmark as well as going beyond the benchmark to look at the specifics of the intended use of that chemical and the potential end-of-life scenarios and how that will impact the choice that's being made for the chemical of concern. And one of the pieces of that the green screen does somewhat uniquely is it also considers transformation products. So in evaluating a parent chemical, a known feasible and relevant transformation product, that is known to occur that's more hazardous and persistent or persistent than the parent chemical can drive the benchmark score. So understanding the end-of-life scenarios and the fact that something may be persistent is kind of a piece of the exposure puzzle that's also integrated into the score of the chemical itself.
Thank you. We have another question about slide 10. Is there any account of how well the alternatives perform their intended use?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think this gets into, again, how do you integrate this piece of the information into some of these broader decision-making frameworks? And there are many ways that organizations are looking at doing this. So the green screen itself looks at the hazard portion and gives you that as a first step or an initial gate to say, okay, let's screen out all the bad actors before we start adding all these other considerations in. But certainly, like with Hewlett-Packard as an example, they won't accept anything that doesn't perform. The alternative still has to, in addition to not being a benchmark 1 chemical, for example, they also have to meet all the performance criteria and all the cost criteria to be selected. So that's something that, again, goes into that making informed decisions. How do you then implement it in your organization, and how do you weave it into this broader decision-making framework? And I will point to a related tool that was developed by Clean Production Action under the Business NGO Working Group, which is the Chemical Alternative Assessment Protocol, and that's a framework that talks about how do you integrate the green screen or some comparative chemical hazard assessment tool with some of these broader considerations such as cost, performance, all those kinds of things. So that is available as well.
So I have a related question, actually, which says that the National Academy of Science has written 3 books on the use and value of risk characterization in regulating hazardous substances. The green screen does not consider exposure levels, but attempts to regulate chemicals solely on animal screening tests. Is it Clean Production's actions intentions to disregard 3 decades of science and advice from the world's foremost scientists who believe that identifying exposure levels is the most critical step in determining the hazard of any substance?
Yeah, thank you. And I think, again, that's kind of pigtailing back on an earlier question. And the answer is it's not about either or, it's about both and it's about where you ask the question and where you are in the decision-making process. So the idea is that that you're asking different questions. When you're looking at the inherent hazard of a chemical, you may be in the design phase or material selection phase where you're asking what's the inherently safest alternative, which is a different question than, is this material safe enough for the intended use? So both of those, the risk assessment and the hazard assessment, are both important and parts of the process, and it's really about where you do that, where you are in your decision-making process, and how you integrate those tools together. So the intention is to be used along with other such tools, such as risk assessment, which has a very valuable place in once a material is selected, ensuring that it's safe enough for its intended use.
Thank you. So the next question is the green screen being interfaced with the Responsible Care Initiative? And maybe you can explain responsible care. Do you know what that is? And you can maybe explain what that is to people.
That is a question that is beyond the scope of my knowledge and understanding, so I would have to get back to the questioner on that and check in with Clean Production Action to get more information on that.
Okay. Well, we will have the question, and we will do our best to contact the questioner, and we're hoping that, also we'll be able to post some of these questions and answers on our website. So the next question is, outside of HP and Poly1, what substances and sectors do you see utilizing green screen technology most? Are there emerging sector uses of significance? For example, green screen use in the surfactant sector, etc. Where do you see green screen going in the future? And another question that was asked that I think can be integrated into this one is a request to talk about the green screen in pharmaceuticals. Has it been used in the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, all great questions. I would say in terms of where the green screen has been used or where I personally see it heading in the future, it's definitely had the largest uptake in the electronics sector. But we have seen pretty significant interest from other areas, specifically of downstream users of chemicals. So we also, Walmart picked up pieces of it and integrated it into some of their screening of their chemical-intensive products. Nike's picked up pieces to integrate into some of the work they're doing with their chemicals work. Shaw is another company that's integrated into some of their work in their floor products company. Many of the companies that subscribe to the Healthy Building Network, Pharos database, so that building sector seems to be ones that are uptaking this whole area and active in this area. So there are some sort of leading sectors. Staples is another company that's engaged in the green screen in this way. And so it's a lot of, currently it's a lot of the downstream users of chemicals, but recently we've also had a lot of interest from the manufacturers themselves saying, wow, this is a really valuable tool for us as manufacturers in communicating to our downstream users. So we've had some different folks that have also given us feedback in that way. In terms of where I see it heading, I think that it's really applicable in many sectors. And one of the questions that we get asked is, how would that be integrated in a highly regulated sector, such as a personal care or pharmaceuticals? And I think that's something that we're very interested in having discussions about that and seeing, if there are certain ways that things could be modified, or is it just simply modifying how you then take that information and make the informed decision. But I think that really it's wide open, and the uptake has been a lot about the initiative of the organizations to really be very proactive in terms of chemical management and selecting safer alternatives. And so I think that's been a big driver. I also think that potentially the regulatory environment will continue to be a big driver in more companies getting engaged in alternative assessment and looking for these types of tools.
Okay, we just have 5 minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions really quickly. The first one wants you to put up the screen again so that people can see again how to subscribe to the Green Screen listserv.
Okay.
So maybe you can do that while I'm asking the last, what will probably be the last question. Does Clean Production Action or their partners provide direct technical assistance, that is sector or site-based green screen application, to any specific entities? Is there a particular focus in where CPA is seeking to apply green screen more vigorously than others? I think you've answered a little bit, but maybe you can be more specific with this question.
Sure. Well, I think one of the pieces of that question is, does CPA or its partners provide direct technical assistance or site-specific assistance? And what Clean Production Action has done is develop partnerships with what we call qualified green screen profilers. And those organizations, they have the latest and greatest, understanding of the method, and they're the experts at really applying that method. And so companies can interface with those organizations specifically to get assessments done or to help problem solve with particularly difficult assessments. So that's a sort of a technical resource. And CPA definitely interfaces with organizations that have questions on certain level, but we do refer folks to those technical experts for some of the more in-depth information that they're looking for, or specific support on how to implement it. So it's a combination of CPA providing some support, and we actually do have an email address. It's greenscreen@cleanproduction.org, where you can email if you have questions or comments or suggestions. But right now, most of that's done through the qualified profiler.